The NSA sponsors an annual paper competition. This is to recognize the best scientific cybersecurity paper published the previous year. We have this year's winner, Tiffany here at the end. But this paper competition, we were doing the 6th time around last year. 7th is ongoing. And we take nominations from the public of papers to evaluate. We have a panel, a group of distinguished experts. Geer at the end is one of our distinguished experts. And we look at these papers and say, which one is the best? We want to recognize and encourage more additional good quality security and scientific security research. Last year's competition, we had 2 papers that were really interesting to us. And they're 2 papers that we just as a community cannot ignore. The first was Cormac Hurley and Paul Van Oshak's paper on systematization of knowledge for science and security. And the second paper was Jonathan Spring, who is on our panel. He wrote a paper on practicing a science of security. And we received both of those papers and said, these are really impactful for the community. I mean, and we need to address them. So we discussed with both within NSA and the HoTSoS organizers on, well, let's try to bring this into HoTSoS and have a discussion on what is the fundamentals, what is a science, what is that science term that we apply to everything. I mean, we have this assumption that science is good, which I guess is good, but there has to be more something below that marketing slogan. So let me introduce our panel, our distinguished panel today. We have Geer from In-Q-Tel, Trent, Jaeger, who is our keynote speaker for tomorrow. So if you liked what he says today, you get to hear more of it tomorrow. We have Jonathan Spring, author of one of the 2 papers, and Tiffany our paper competition winner from last year. And I am Adam Tagert. I am the technical lead for the NSA Science and Security Program. And I also run the paper competition. So it's very interesting for me to read these 2 papers in the sense that they are an evaluation of stuff that I'm very familiar with and kind of do. So it's a very unique position here being a panel moderator. So to begin, in Jonathan's paper, he actually quoted a Jason report from 2008. This was one of the, not only was it instrumental in his paper, it was also instrumental to the process of creating the Science and Security Program at NSA. One of the justifications for the science and security, I'm going to just read a paragraph from it, just so to set the context from 2008, 10 years ago, on why we're all here today. Our current security approaches have had limited success and have become an arms race with our adversaries. In order to achieve security breakthroughs, we need a more fundamental understanding of science of cybersecurity. However, we do not even have the fundamental concepts, principles, mathematical constructs, or tools to reliably predict or even measure cybersecurity. It is currently difficult to determine the qualitative impact of changing the cybersecurity, more secure, less secure, much less quantify the impact of some specific scale. We do not have the tools to do experiments that can produce results that could be compared to theory, models, or simulations. Request the Jasons consider whether cybersecurity can become or should be a science. If so, identify what is needed to create a science of cybersecurity and recommend specific ways in which scientific methods can be applied to cybersecurity. If not, what can we learn from the practice of science that will enable us to improve our security of our cyber infrastructure and assure the integrity of information that resides in the information technology infrastructure? So we can all be happily recognized or unhappily recognized. We have not solved this problem yet, so that's why we're still here. To begin, Jonathan, could you take a couple minutes and explain what your paper is about, including defining what inductive and deductive mean?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Adam. I also want to thank my co-authors, Tyler Moore and David Pym. David is here, so you can harass both of us. You don't have to just harass me. Send half of you to David. So I was thinking sort of how this should be maybe best introduced. And I also, so our paper a little bit sort of chastises the Hurley and Van Oorschot paper, but I think that there's a lot more points where we agree actually than we disagree, so I don't want to overemphasize the points of disagreement. But I think that as the sort of JSON report gets at, the idea is that you want to do something, you want to make the system better somehow. And so I take science, I mean, there's a couple of ways that you could take science, right? I take it in practical sense of being about how do you ask questions well, right? Which is a little bit different maybe than how you understand the answers, which is also part of it. I think that with the paper that we published at NSPW, the narrative sort of goes something like this. A bunch of people seem to be saying that security is not a science. I reread the Van Oorschot and Hurley paper, and I don't think they actually come down with an answer as one way or another. But everyone else that I know of that is published on this, besides Alex Knott, who is the Army Research Lab person, has said that it's not a science, basically, which confuses me a little bit, because I think that what we're all doing is science. And so I wanted to try to grind out sort of why those mismatches are, why I think that what we're doing is science, and then I guess how we move forward with asking the question of why is this scientific process producing unsatisfactory results? Because I think that the JSON report could be adequately summarized that way, as opposed to is this science, which I find to be somewhat unproductive because it doesn't tell us what to do differently. So, I mean, we start the paper off with a bit of history, right, for, you know, the history of falsifiability, because this term factors quite importantly, I think, into a lot of the discussions. And I think the important thing maybe to remember is that that actually was about, in interwar Austria, in Vienna, distinguishing between things that were not fascist and not the Pope, right? Like, they wanted things that were evidence-based policymaking, basically, to use modern terms. But they weren't really trying to say what was, I mean, they were trying to say what was science, but the German word for science and other knowledge work is the same word, and so that gets a bit confused anyway. So I think it's a bit in the weeds, but I think that background is important if we're going to talk about what is and isn't science. The sort of deduction-induction thing that Adam asked me to define, right, either has some clear sense in mathematics, but then if you want to bring that over into science, then you have to believe that what we're reasoning with is logical statements, which in the context of falsifiability is explicitly what they thought. But I don't think that we think that anymore. I don't think that when we make a statement about whether it's physics or biology or economics, we think we're making a statement in first-order predicate logic. Like, I don't think that's what we're doing. I think we have models that we're reasoning with, and those models can be lots of different things. So, you know, I think that there's a lot of ways that security might be considered to not be a science. People talk about how you can't do experiments. We go through some length of talking about how what we actually want is structured observations of the empirical world, which might be case studies or natural experiments or these other things, right? So if attack papers are case studies, it's okay that they're not experiments, but how do we do case studies well? You know, oh, we can't reproduce anything in security. It's like, well, there's at least 5 different senses of reproduction, so maybe we can corroborate things, right? There's also statistical senses of reproducibility versus sort of more qualitative generalization things, right? So like that's a bit narrow as far as criticism. A lot of the stuff around induction and deduction also sort of revolves around whether there's laws of nature, because laws of nature are supposed to be these generalizations that we can deduce consequences from. But the modern, meaning since the 80s, understanding of physics, science in general, from philosophy of science, is that nothing has laws, right? There aren't laws of physics in the way that you mean. Like, the people who used laws like Newton, I think were trying to keep the church from excommunicating them, and so they wanted to imply a lawgiver, which is super useful if you want to not be excommunicated in the 1700s, but is not super useful when you're talking about man-made systems, because how could there be a law of nature in a man-made system? Like, we've constructed the system to be a certain way. So I think that you want to talk about maybe like mechanistic understanding, making the system intelligible or something like this. These sorts of things. There's some other common criticisms like, we can't move forward until there's an ontology that we all agree with. But I think that that's also a bit of a straw man, right? Like, we all need to be able to talk to each other. But being able to talk to each other doesn't mean that we all use exactly the same ontology. It means that we can translate into each other's specializations. Because we all are specialized in different things of necessity, and that's super good. We shouldn't try to make all of the specializations all be the same, because they're not specialized anymore. Those sorts of things. So I'm super excited to see what everyone else has to say about this. I'm hoping that you don't all throw tomatoes at me. I think that they were all cut up outside, so they'd be harder to throw. But I'm interested to see what everyone else has to say. I think that that's a fine way to get started.
I think that's excellent. So to begin the conversation we're going to have, I'm going to ask a couple questions, and then at some point, after maybe 2 rounds of questions, I'll open it up to other people who would like to try to advance our conversation. But as moderator's prerogative, I get a couple questions here. So for Dan, you've been evaluating papers for the paper competition for 6 years. You've been evaluating papers for the paper competition for 6 years. What are some of the things that you look at for good quality science? And the second part of this is that you've been quoted in both papers saying that the distinguished experts have different opinion of what is paramount. How do you think that fits into a quality of a science?
Do I have to turn this on? No, apparently not. Okay, yes, I've been one of the experts reading papers for a while, which is actually a privilege, frankly. Thank you, Adam. Same reason that I recommend all of you, whenever you get a chance, be on a program committee, because there's the one nice feature is people bring their best work to you. You don't have to chase it down. That being said, over the years that I've done this, we have changed a little bit. Some people have gone on to other things. Some new ones have come in. But I do think I'm not sure disagree is the right word, though I have written exactly that, disagree. It's which of the various characteristics you might describe a science of security containing that you would give primacy to, because we do have to make a decision. And when you have to make a decision, at some point you have to decide what's more important than other possible considerations. One of those might be reproducibility. One of those might be the classic definition of science of falsifiability. One might be, is it explained in a way that does not require you to be one of the 6 people who can read that kind of language on the planet? One of them might be, does it produce a way to look at the world that yields further research opportunities on the basis of this result? It's like opening a cave door. Oh my goodness, look at that. There's a cavern we didn't know. Should we go there? I could go on, but you get the idea. And I think it's actually healthy that we are open about that. Now, if you were going to, I'm sure somebody was waiting for me to say this, but if you were going to quote T.S. Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, one of the things he would say is that it is not yet a science, but rather, quote, pre-paradigmatic, unquote, if in fact the practitioners do not share a worldview that in turn, in a sort of circular way, defines the science as those who hold this worldview, or defines those who hold this worldview as the practitioners of a certain science. And that from time to time, that may break down and realign itself. Classic example, Newtonian mechanics to Einstein and relativity. Perhaps earlier classic example, the separation of astronomy and astrology, or the separation of chemistry and physics. That idea that there are moments when the experts disagree to the point where there is a realignment is when, on the one hand, you might call it a revolution, which was Kuhn's point here, or you might simply say that something was not yet a science when it reaches a point at which the existing ideas, as embodied by the existing paradigm, are not sufficient to explain what is the research frontier at this point. You will recall that Einstein was revulsed by quantum mechanics, just as an example. Where we have to agree as a, if I can call it that, committee or panel of people reading these papers, is which one of these is most likely to advance the, as frankly, yet not fully defined idea of a science of security. And so there, I think we go in the direction of two of the things I just mentioned, and of course there's several others. One of them is, does this open a new frontier? Does this open a new research opportunity? Does this tell you something, you know, we should pursue that harder? And two, does it have a clarity of description of the work that was done, which implies that most of those who listen to it or read the paper or in some other way acquire the contents of it would be able to assimilate it without having to start at first principles. Is that fair enough, Adam?
I think so. I was really wondering how long it would take for Kuhn to make an appearance.
How long I'm sorry, folks. I'm down to one good ear. It's just one of those things. What did you say, Adam?
I was wondering how long it would take for Kuhn to make an appearance in your answer.
All right. You got your wish.
Trent, when you advise students who are becoming new scientists, what are the attributes that you try to instill into the student researcher for, to become good scientists in the future?
Well, typically when students start out, there's sort of this, I guess, two-dimensional notion that they have sort of a level of knowledge about computer science that, an early graduate student will have. Some of them have, some extra knowledge in specific areas, but there's sort of this baseline knowledge. This relates, I think, a little bit to what Dan was saying about how, how many people would understand the paper that was written. And so you're sort of talking to someone, trying to, at that level, to impart knowledge to them. And then there are various, sort of challenges in computer security that we face. And so I think I do systems work. And so in doing systems work, we tend to, try to look at systems, measure them. And with respect to security, at least, if you look at a system, you measure how it behaves with respect to security, there's a good chance you're going to find an anomaly of some kind. And then if the students have the passion to dig into the a particular anomaly, you actually find several anomalies probably, but it's then driven by then trying to study the principles related to that anomaly, and then whether those principles, how those principles could be extended to address that anomaly. So I'll leave it at that for now.
All right, Tiffany. Your award-winning paper, which we're all excited to read or have you present tomorrow, you talk about game theory. And one of the attributes that we really liked about your paper is that you didn't just create a game theoretic model of a scenario and then use some toy example to justify that you were correct. And look how amazing my model is. Instead, you applied it to a real world, or as much of a real world situation as we can have right now in cybersecurity. To get there, were you trying to make predictions about what your research would or about your game theory model, and talk about the effort to validate your model.
So this is a great question because that paper, so we have a multiple addition for that paper. At the beginning, that paper doesn't have the part that we evaluate the model on a the cyber grant challenge, which is one of the, I would say, real world but in a mimic way competition. And we got a lot of feedbacks from the reviewers asking us like, hey, you have this model, then so what? Like how to apply this? And this is not only just a problem in my game theory paper, this is more likely to be a problem in a lot of game theory papers or a lot of theory papers as well. And we do this. I think one is that we are lucky in a way that there is a competition waiting for us over there, and we can really use our model to evaluate. On the other hand, I also know that there are researchers who's trying to really, really work hard to gain some data, to get some data from real world in order to apply their theoretical work. So I see a gap. I see a gap over there between the theory people and the system people. How can they collaborate together? Since the system people will help you implement or realize a model and make it to be not only just a prototype, it can be a real world, product, but also provide those data, those feedback back to the theory people so that the researchers can build more comprehensive and also more realistic model based on the observations they get from the system. And when we work on this particular paper, I think we have both systematic people who are working on binary analysis and who are actually building this cyber reasoning system in the game. And also, I myself has some experience in working on game theory, so we combined together and we came up with a very interesting result. I see that as a one of the, I would say, unique experience, and I know that this is not something that can be generalized at this point, but I do hope that we can push this more forward in the future so that we can have these two groups of people really collaborating together and think about how to combine their fancy work all together to make theoretical breakthrough realistic, transfer or translate that to real world.
Thank you, Tiffany. Jonathan, in your paper you say we shouldn't be looking at producing falsifiable statements. Instead, what is good science is a good process to on how do we conduct our work. Can you there's a two-part question. Can you explain what you mean by science is a process? And for the other three panelists, do you have, after he explains it, do you agree with it, or do you think there's some tweak that you would like to propose?
So the two parts are, I answer that question and then everyone else beats me up? Those are the two parts?
That is the two parts.
Or are there two parts for me?
That's the first part's you, and then they beat you up.
Okay.
If you think they're wrong.
So I think if I'm going to be a little bit revisionist about my word choice, I'd probably say that science is a set of processes, although that's a little bit harder, right? There's this textbook sense that we all have from 5th grade science class that like there's the scientific method, capital S, capital M. There are scientific methods, I think. And so when I say that science is a process, what I'm trying to differentiate is that, answers could be correct. I suppose answers could be falsifiable. Like, they could be. I don't think that that's super useful to talk about falsifiable answers. But like, that is certainly a property of answers, regardless. Not a property of processes. Right, so science is the method of arriving at an answer. Right, so designing an experiment, conducting it, interpreting the results. Right, the interpretation is an important part of the process. Then you get an answer of some kind. So a process is scientific, an answer is correct or not, or adequate, really, because I don't think that there's one, right? Whether something is adequate for your purposes depends on your purposes, right? So it's not really correct in some sort of like capital T true sense. Like we know from the like sort of mathematics and logic literature that there's not like one sense of true, things are only true in certain interpretations given the model and whatever, right? Anyway, that's what I mean when I say that science is a process, to distinguish it between something like an answer, which is at least could have the property of being falsifiable if you want to talk about it, what the, which I don't, but when we want to talk about whether something is a science, we need to be talking about a process. And I think then we can say some useful things about like, oh, like have you considered this experiment design consideration to make your process a little bit more robust, you know, scientific, whatever, as opposed to just sort of snapshots of answers. So does that seem totally insane?
So yeah, that would be my follow-up question. Does that sound totally insane?
No, it's not insane at all. You know, it's funny the number of people who've long said that security is a process, not a fact. It's so it has a nice consistency, and in particular, by the way, I am unabashedly on the it's not science unless it's falsifiable side of the house, but I'm also a statistician by training, and all data has bias. The question is, can you correct for it? So I just told you how to correct for mine. But the thing that I look for, the thing that when I'm reading a paper or listening to a talk that grabs me in particular, is does it have predictive power? And sometimes the predictive power can be right there in the mathematics, and sometimes it can be in something else. We all know that, or I think we all agree, let me put it that way, that security is not composable. You can take two secure components and put them together and end up with an insecure result. Interestingly enough, I would say insecurity is composable. And so I look at, for example, what the language theoretic security people are doing as an example of trying to get at the composability question in a way that's actually well structured, and I would consider what they're doing to be science. And I sort of hope unarguably, but nevertheless, science. On the other hand, what do I make of, say, VirusTotal? We took a piece of potential malware, we showed it to whatever it is currently, 40-something different detectors. If all of them say it's okay, it's probably okay. If any one of them says it's probably worth further study, I guess I would take that. And what is the nature of evidence that would cause you, this goes back to prediction, what is the nature of evidence that would cause you to change your plan? And that's where I would come down, I think. Evidence that would cause you to change your naive plan.
Science. So it seems that there are a lot of contextual applications of the term science. We talked a bit, Jonathan talked a bit about scientific method, and Dan mentioned the predictive power of the result of the science, and I think those are both two important things with respect to science. And then there's this whole myriad of, if we look at every paper that's been published, we could, have a vote here. Every paper, say, in some conference, we'd look at them and, are they science or are they not science? And I'm sure, there are biases, as Dan said, and we'd come down in different places with respect to that. There seems to be, I guess, from my perspective, sort of, I may be biased toward my 5th grade science textbooks in the sense of the things that you learn, the things that have the most predictive power, the things that are the most fundamental for doing prediction are often presented, boiled down to, distilled into these books, and these are the things you learn as being science, And so I have, I guess, a bias toward science that has a lot of predictive power in a lot of situations that people have found useful. And a lot of research that we do, a lot of papers that we do, a lot of papers that I do, are maybe not necessarily giving you that complete predictive power, E equals MC squared kind of equation out of it, but rather, as Jonathan I think alluded to briefly, maybe more of a case study. Hey, we're looking at a specific type of vulnerability in a specific type of system in a specific way with a specific threat model with some assumptions that are maybe, hopefully we can make explicit, but hopefully there aren't too many implicit ones, things of this nature. And we generate some data, and that data, interpreted in an appropriate light, and the reviewers, I guess, were convinced that it was interpreted respectably with respect to the light that we set forward, has some meaning to advancing our overall understanding. But a challenge is how we as a community, I think, combine all of the results of all of these papers and all of these different systems and all of this, the different experiments for all of these different vulnerabilities with all these different techniques and all these somewhat different trust models and assumptions together. And so that's, I think, a challenge we face in achieving science, is how we take all this work and relate it to one another to then come up with principles.
I'm going to lean in there and say, and I think that a hallmark of that is when you get a result you didn't expect or want, what do you do?
Oh, I rushed to publish that paper because I know that's the most interesting thing, is when we think we believe X, and we measure X under reasonable conditions, and we find that X isn't true, at least in some non-trivial set of cases. That, I think, is the knowledge that most excites me, and I think the community also is most interested in that, judging by the rapidity of those papers being accepted as opposed to other ones that we have to sort of fight through. But then how to collect all of that together coherently is a challenge that we face, I think, as scientists, is that there's a fair bit of data, more and more. Everybody plugs something new into the internet, right? And whenever you plug something new into the internet, I have sort of joke that this creates a new, at least a new PhD thesis, right, each time. So, it's kind of a little bit disturbing that we don't have enough data points, we don't have enough of these principles to be able to prevent people from plugging something into the internet and not sort of recreate some of these problems we've seen all over again.
Yeah, and I'd like to comment when Dan and when Jaeger talks about falsifiability, and also in terms of we have some, I would say, guess at the beginning or intuition at the beginning, and after tested, it turns out that this intuition is wrong, or it is just counterintuitive. Actually, this is a good thing, but sometimes we think this is a failure instead of saying, oh, this is just counterintuitive. And I feel that currently we don't have an incentive to encourage people to show that, oh, this thing doesn't work, or because when people think about falsifiability, it's always thinking about, I want to make it true. I want to say this statement is always correct, and this is counted as a success, and this is something that you can publish as a paper. And unfortunately, we are evaluated by publications, especially tenure track professors. Unfortunately, that's the case. So the question is, if now the society, the community doesn't say, oh, if you found something that doesn't work, it's good, you should also publish that, then we just keep hiding that information. It could be something, it's actually worth publishable because you're telling people that this doesn't work, to avoid the other people repeating the same failure of you. But also, if you can really generalize this, you tell people this is a general failure. And if you can show that this is a success failure, actually, I think it's also worthy to publish. And I feel that we have less incentive in this regard, and I think this is something that the entire community should try to work on.
There are so many, okay, awesome. I really, Tiffany, really appreciate the sort of lack of incentive for publishing negative results. Some people here might be familiar with the LASER conference. Is this being recorded?
Right now, yeah.
Okay.
Should we pause?
No, I'm gonna, hold on. I think that one of the difficulties with incentivizing negative results is that we all have to agree on when something just isn't a result because there was a fatal error in the way that study was done, and when there's a negative result, which means the study was done well, and the statistics tell you that you can't distinguish the two cases you're trying to distinguish between. Right, like, negative doesn't really have something to do with what you were trying to tell us either, right? It doesn't really have to do with what you were trying to prove. It has to do with the statistical test didn't find a difference. But that only makes sense if you've done the power analysis first to show that it's gonna be a result. Okay, so negative results and non-results are not the same. But that being said, we certainly should have more negative results. And I think that this is one of the biases that thinking about things as if falsification is the relevant demarcation criterion, I think this is one of the dangerous outcomes of doing that. Because if what you understand of your science is a sort of integrative pluralism of multiple fields contributing constraints on the explanation of the phenomenon, negative results are valuable. Right? And the words that I just said are more or less the consensus, I think, understanding of what science is in a lot of fields. But if you think about it in this sort of naive falsificationist demarcation, then negative results aren't valuable, and so you don't publish them. Which messes with your statistics, which I think you should appreciate, right? So the publication bias issues that we see, like, I think are probably worse in security because everyone rushes to publish exciting results, right? Like, there's a clear bias, statistic bias, in the results that get published, which means that even if we wanted to do meta-studies of the things that were well-designed experiments, we couldn't do them because the meta-study statistical analysis things require there not to be biases in the data you're getting, right? So, Trent, like, you expressed perfectly what people actually do with unexpected results, which is rush to publish them, right? But the fact that then, Tiffany, what you said is that we don't have people who are rushing to publish just the results of whatever they've done means that we can't do meta-studies, which means that we can't combine the heterogeneous papers that we have, which is what you asked for, right? At least the statistical ones. When things aren't statistical experiments, we can't do meta-studies, but that's fine. We can do case studies and generalize. It's a bit harder, right? I think that Peter Gallison spoke at the first HoTSoS, and his research as a historian of physics is a lot about the fact that, so theory people and practical physicists, so experimental physicists, so exactly your distinction that you made about your game theory and the practitioners, right? He makes the same distinction between the people working on, like, the Large Hadron Collider, right? There's the people who build the big super-cooled magnets, and there's the people who work on the theory of string theory, and they actually don't know anything about each other. They have trading zones where they translate between each other, and I think that we can do better to establish sort of intellectual trading zones between our different, exactly as you're talking about. So I think that was touching on all of the things that everyone said.
So I have a follow-up question for you, since you just brought it up. A big part of doing science is building complicated measurement tools or engineering some type of new sensor. Do you feel that that is part of science, or do you feel that is part of an engineering process?
So I guess I'll try to be quick because it seems like everyone else also has important things to say. Yes. Would you like to give me a disjunctive or in your question?
Yes, I would like you. Yeah, it's too easy to say yes, it's both.
Okay, so I think though that in some seriousness, like when you build a microscope, are you doing engineering or are you doing science? Like the first person to build the first microscope, how did you know that the things that you saw, the animalcules in the pond water, that's what he called them for whatever reason, were not artifacts of your microscope and were actually things in the world? Right? Like there's an engineering question in there. Did you build the tool correctly? And there's a science question in there. What can you generalize? And in general, there's not a sharp line.
I'd like to provide a concrete example in binary analysis community. So in binary analysis community, we have a metric that's called LAVA, and LAVA M is specifically for memory corruption data set. And there are tons of binary analysis techniques that are built to, based on the evaluation of LAVA. They do evaluate their tools based on LAVA, but this LAVA project is also published in Auckland in IEEE Security and Privacy. So I see that, based on the peer reviewers' opinion and based on the community's acknowledgement, for us, at least for binary analysis, building the measurement, building the matrix itself does have security and especially scientific merit, so that people appreciate that and have it published in top-tier security conference.
I'll take the engineering side. Good example, the first microscope was science. After that, it was engineering, I think. Not to put down I have an engineering degree. I'm not going to put it down, but it seems to me, how shall I put this? That for in a situation of science versus, I don't know how to put this. There's a difference between when somebody in the lab yells "Eureka" and somebody yells, "That's weird." There's a difference between those two. "That's weird" goes off in the direction of a paradigm change, sending a stream of ions through a diffraction grating and you get a weird result. Versus "Eureka, I finally figured out how to synthesize chemical XYZ. The engineering part takes over, I think, fairly quickly. What would you call Edison? An engineer, I think. He didn't care how the world worked. He cared what would make a filament in a light bulb. And there's a lot of progress there. And one could almost argue that he was doing a science-like operation, because how many things did he try before he hit on, tungsten wire? You can use the scientific method outside of science. So the question is, well, what is your purpose? What is your purpose? One could argue that Niels Bohr didn't care how the world worked. Edison Niels Bohr didn't care whether it had any practical implication, but Edison did. Louis Pasteur is maybe an unusual example because he wanted both. I think the science part of this is for our purposes here, in the sense of we all come to a sort of common understanding because it allows us to form a community and all of that, probably ought to be around the methods more than the facts. Because in our field, I think the facts are too evanescent. They change or many of the facts change too often. So I think we have to stick to a community of methods in some sense. I'm talking out loud. I'm just thinking out loud here, but.
So if I think about a lot of the research that I've seen, there seems to be a combination of all of the above in one form or another. A lot of papers I review get accepted, I think, because people were excited about the tool that was built to do the research, maybe even more so than the specific data that was generated. as a result in that particular case, but more that the tool opens up an opportunity of, you know, a whole new set of experiments and perhaps being able to find, you know, bigger answers. But yeah, I think we ideally would like to see these new tools used in a way that complies with the scientific method, certainly. And probably not that many papers will immediately give us some result that has this really, really, really powerful predictive power that we're hoping for. But some might give us the data that will help lead to that at some point in the future, and the tools. So there seem to be a little bit of everything.
Yeah, I think right now, if we look at those publications, having a tool, or especially opening source or releasing the tool, is definitely going to be a strength in their paper. When reviewers, you know, put their strength and weaknesses over there, having a tool publishable is definitely a strength. But also, I think current community, we do appreciate approach, we do appreciate method. If you just solely publish a tool, it's not gonna be counted as a or, you know, as the unique contribution that is good enough to get published. So people do think about what is the essential problem and what is the approach that solve this problem, or, you know, push the frontier of the research in this problem. And another thing that I would like to mention is that for some papers, I really like them because they are very informative for me. Like, I think for paper, part of the purpose of the paper is to educate, it's education. So I really enjoy some papers, especially when, like, the paper talking about the background of the entire problem or the entire community's efforts on solving this problem. And I think this is something that I know not everyone really pay a lot of attention to. When we write paper, we spend sometimes, I was told that some people spend like 70% of the time in writing introduction, and another 20% writing evaluation, and then the other 10% of the time writing like background or the rest of the paper. Because right now it's so competitive that you really need to find a way to sell your paper. You're a businessman. You are you have to be able to learn, you know, to pitch well. This is unfortunate. I don't know how to change that, unfortunately. Meanwhile, I think probably we want to wait more on, you know, how informative this paper is, and also how well educated this paper is to benefit the future researchers. Like 10 years later, if someone's gonna catch this field, someone is gonna learn, how can they learn? What can they learn by reading that paper?
So I think that this is really amazing the way that the conversation goes, but I also, I'm really interested because we seem to flip really fluidly between talking about science as a sort of concept and sort of the sociology of the scientists. Or like, what are the incentives of the practitioners in the field to do things certain ways or to do things other ways, right? I would just like to point out that sociology of science is super interesting, but is not the same thing as sort of philosophy of science, or how do you do the science well, sort of in an abstract way. And so it could be simultaneously true that security is totally a science and we understand the philosophy of science of what we ought to do, but the sociological incentives from a sociology of science point of view aren't aligned for that to actually happen. And so what people say when they say security is not a science is they mean it's not being done as well as I want it to be. They might be talking about a sociology of science question, not a philosophy of science question, and it might be valuable to not conflate those. And sort of in the like, so I think Kuhn was the first sociologist of science, really, and like that lineage has continued on. So like Peter Geer, the Intelligibility of Nature book, I would recommend if anyone hasn't had a chance. Right, but he defined science as a prestigious label. I'm going to stop the rest of the definition there, right, because the rest of it isn't relevant to this point, right? The prestige part is actually important when we label something as science, and so that goes along with the incentives. And I'm not sure exactly that I have any answers to all of the things that you guys have been saying. But maybe specifying the question slightly better might be helpful.
I want to come back to something Trent said, and I'm sorry to derail that because that was excellent, but you mentioned about the excitement over the apparatus. I think we are at a kind of fork in the road where we have to decide what we're going to do about where the apparatus is a data set that you can't reproduce. You can't go out and collect your own version of that. And yet, of course, the characteristics under which it was collected and so forth are part of what the artifact you're looking at. You know, and so I think data science is both useful to, if you want to call it, you know, we could have another debate on whether data is, you know, that whole term we'll put aside. But I think we're at a kind of fork in the road about do we focus on, for example, the integrity or the mechanism by which data came to be. I'm going to hand this back to you because what you said about the excitement over an apparatus, I think applies to the excitement over a data set.
Yeah, I guess when I was mentioning that, I guess my excitement was that I could create and replicate the data collection rather than you know, sort of have to depend on somebody else producing the data set. Is that getting it?
Well, there's.
So
what is the name of that data set of system traces that Google just put out? It's huge. It's absolutely huge. It tells you a lot about how VMs work in the real world. Is that engineering or is it science? You know, you can probably do science using the data set, is my point.
Okay.
First of all, there's not. I appreciate that data set. It's just like this data set does not always exist for all different kinds of research that we're looking at. On the other hand, is that tons of data sets means that it is a good data set or not? You have a data set. This data set has, let's say, millions of cases, whereas there is another data set contains only 100 cases, but the cases are very different. So it's like back to the question, is measurement itself is a science or not? Is data science is a science or not? And it's kind of, these two are combining together, and actually maybe that is interesting. There is another perspective, which is there is also a gap probably between our doing system, but also the people who are looking into data science or security data science. And it would be great if these two communities can also combine and reason about, you know, how to build a good, or, you know, or how to measure the goodness of a data set.
Do you think the data set is the next generation of the new microscope?
Is data set the next? I don't think there's any one thing. But it is, we do have a weird situation with security where, you know, the systems can be changed basically on the same time frame as the observations. And so data sets become much sort of narrower in scope as to their potential generalizability. And I think that there's got to be some, so like, is the data set engineered, I guess is not a question I had thought about, but my heuristic, which is a heuristic and totally fallible, is that you're engineering something if you're looking towards the future and trying to change the world with it, and you're doing science if you're trying to make a generalization, and then you're doing forensics if you're looking backwards and trying to tell us something about the past. I don't want to put a whole lot of weight in those distinctions because there's sort of, I think that there's a lot of methodological overlap. And so to your point, Dan, if the thing that brings us together is shared methods, I don't think that there's a clean distinction between engineering methods and scientific methods. And so if the thing that matters is shared methods, then maybe it doesn't matter. But my heuristic is, you know, if you're engineering something, it's you're looking to change the world going into the future, and I'm having a hard time seeing how curating a data set does that, unless what I guess you're trying to affect is the way that different maybe machine learning algorithms are trained. Maybe you could be trying to do something around that, but I'm not sure that I can cleanly make that argument.
I'm going to take a moment. Anybody else, any audience members would like to ask a question? Lori.
In the writing are the components of science there so people can build on them in the future. And so he did that work, and he had grad students that looked at papers. 2 or 3 people looked at a paper. He sent it to the authors to get their confirmation back about what the evidence. So that was not well received in the security community. I'd say half of the authors complied, half of the authors were almost hostile, and so it was published in HoTSoS. So just wanted to get your thoughts on that line of work. You want to say something? Okay.
Sure, I think it's great. So I've seen at least one of Jeff's presentations on that. I would put that firmly in sociology of science, basically, which I think is great and we should do more of. But then we end up with all the problems we just discussed about how to incentivize people to change. And that's a question that's above my pay grade. Adam, how would you incentivize people to change?
Well, that's why I have a panel.
Does anyone else want to?
I'd like to add in the same line of discussion. I'm almost attending IEEE Security and Privacy for the last 15 years. And I have seen in recent years, many of the publications, it's more purely on the current technology based. I'm giving an example. Like Java 3.2.1 has this vulnerability and we solved it. And we suggested. By the time the paper is presented, that problem people have already solved, the company already solved. So how do you handle where is the science? Because purely on technology and technology driving crazy, because of now if you see everybody is in AI, everybody is applying machine learning, even without knowing what is machine learning is, using tools, plug and play. So where is the science? And I think in security, science may be a challenging issue because you do security on a technology, but technology changes rapidly. Any thoughts, Dan?
I will start first, and I will pass it to Dan. Yeah. So there are papers about that, but I see that there are few papers that are published in top tier, like the top 4 security conferences recently, just for attacking papers. And I know that there was a year that Auckland had a lot of attacking papers, and this came to a discussion about whether or not we really want to put attacking papers into, top tier conferences. So I guess my opinion is that fixing bug or finding a vulnerability is, it's not worth to be published in a top tier conference. That's my personal opinion. That might be harsh, and I know I'm gonna be recorded, but this is my opinion. This is my honest thought. But if you can really generalize that, not only just like generalize, all the prior Java versions has this problem, but mostly it's, let's say it is a methodology, or it is a vulnerability in methodology, not just specific to a product. It really can be generalized, and finding this vulnerability itself does bring in new knowledge, then I think it's well worth it to publish. I wouldn't say it's top tier. I can't decide whether or not it's published. It depends on the contribution of the knowledge itself. But I would say if there is knowledge, new knowledge involves in, then I think it's something that is well worth to let people know, or well worth to publish as an academic research paper. And like science, the word, it comes from knowledge. Like in particular, like originally this word itself means knowledge I think it's in Greek. And then they, involve that, and now we have this science. But I believe that essentially science is knowledge. If you cannot produce new knowledge, new generalizable knowledge, I don't think that is an actual science. It's not sufficient, but at least it's not necessary for that.
On some attack papers, I do think unarguably are science, the ones that sort of revealed Spectre and Meltdown, the whole idea of doing predictive execution has its flaws, and you have to demonstrate that to get people's attention. So I thought those were excellent. But generally speaking, I admit I'm a fan, but that's why I brought up the Langsec folks, because they're trying to show, is there a way to think about the fact that so many of the vulnerabilities that are exploited have as a component the processing of hostile input? Is there a way of thinking about that from a first principles point of view? Is it treating all input as a parser, for example? Is it a language? Are we looking at, in effect, context-dependent languages when you think about the input that should be given to a program, unlike sending it 50,000 lowercase a's and then it breaks for your benefit? One that I think might be quite interesting in that regard is there any aspect of what we care about, I'll continue to use Langsec for example, is there any aspect of what we care about that might be composable? Could you make parsers into something composable? And that would apply to, for example, the interpretation of network traffic, which is basically a parsing problem. Does that lead us somewhere? How far can you push that idea of composability? Are there areas where we can do that? And I would consider those to be unarguably science, for example.
Thanks. Yeah, so the attack papers, they get people excited in terms of whether they should, the attacks really hit the bar or not. And thinking about a hypothetical situation, if it's just a bug, and the bug isn't, in the case of Spectre Meltdown, that was a whole new class of vulnerabilities, so that's an important issue. In the case of some other attack papers, maybe they have a technique in finding the flaw or finding the exploit that is useful and generalizable to other things. But frankly, when I see the attack papers these days in my pile of papers to review, and there's still, of course, lots of them because there are many of them published, if the paper has kind of a half-baked defense, they'll have that, you've seen the attack papers, right? They talk about the attack, and then they have a little section at the end that says, maybe there's some defenses, but yeah, we can't really come up with it. I'm not really very happy about those papers unless the attack dimension is quite profound, and the methods for revealing the success of the attack are themselves significant. So if you submit those papers and I review them, then I'm going to be not liking them quite as much. I mean, almost all paper, well, I of course have some attack papers like everyone has to. But I feel like, and you may be able to pick out a paper of mine that does not meet this bar and say, you didn't do it either. But I feel like we do try to really dig into the defense, not just focus on the attack, and really investigate how to prevent this attack from occurring as well. And I'd like to see that with quote-unquote attack papers. I think a lot of papers have 0 days in them, but they should also move the bar a bit on preventing these from occurring in the future in some way, either by the tools to find the attacks more efficiently or the defenses.
Awesome. I have a stake in the ground on this. I think attack papers are case studies, right? So if you replace the word, so in the question, are attack papers science? If you replace the word attack paper with case study, the answer is clearly 100% yes, case studies are part of science. Can you do a case study terribly and have it be totally useless? Also yes. Can you do a case study that's of something so specific that no one should care about it? Also yes, right? I don't understand why we don't hold attack papers to those same standards as we hold all other case studies, which is basically what everyone just said. What those standards are, like some suggestions of them. I'm sure there's more, because there are books that are 1,000 pages thick on how to do good case studies, right? Okay. Does that seem like, then I think you also asked about, like, you know, technology changes super fast. This is part of why the case studies might not be useful, because the technology might change, which is, I think, something that everyone grabbed onto. In our paper, I touch on this a little bit in the sense that people seem to want either experiments to be done by hand for them to be science, or for the results to last for a really long time, right? And I don't really understand why we can't automate experiments like with malware analysis, have that count, and have the results only be stable for 10 seconds, because then you know that the blacklist is going to have to change, and why that's not science, right? Like, it's okay for things to not be stable for a really long time, as long as you know that, and you've designed everything with that in mind, right? Like, the stability is a big problem if you design your experiment to take place over 7 days, and the thing you're measuring is only stable over 30 seconds. But if you design a series of 30-second long experiments and analyze them appropriately, it's fine, right? So I think that I've done another paper on general shareable knowledge in information security to try to get out what general shareable knowledge would need to look like and what the barriers are and stuff, and I think that we can talk about it. But I don't think that, like, is it a science is the right question, right? Like, yeah, it's a science. How do you do a good case study? Okay, I can work with that.
You know, I'm not going to attack at all what you just said, but I guess it's a bias. It's my inherent assumption. Maybe we should, as a community, decide whether we like it or not. I view the permanence of the result as a characteristic to be sought. And 10 seconds, I realize, if you're counting nanoseconds, 10 seconds is one hell of a long time. I don't have enough lifetime left to do that. But the permanence of the result, or the longevity of the result, the degree to which other results can be based upon it in a chain of longevity, strikes me as extremely desirable. I just don't know whether I'm going to go as far as you did and say it's a characteristic, not it's not necessary. I almost think it would be necessary.
I think, first of all, I'm kind of in the middle, in a way that I think it is science, but every science has value. There is, you know, high science value, there's low science value. There is although it can't really be quantified, but we can have like a qualitative, probably, evaluation on this paper has higher science merit, this paper has relatively lower science value, and I think which is why, you know, we have papers with different scores when we submit. On the other hand, I want to neutralize this word attack. I feel that we do have bias in a way that we have our emotion when we talk about attack paper. What if we just change attack to defense? What if instead of saying, oh, I find a bug in JavaScript, Java, yeah. So I find a bug in Java, we say, I fix a bug in Java, or I patch it in Java for particularly Java, a particular version. So do you still think that there is an argument for whether or not this paper to be accepted or not. And if we change that word, do you have a more clearer mind? I feel I do if I change that word. I think it's not only just whether or not it's a tag paper, it's more likely to be, let's just forget about whether or not it's a tag. Just look at the scope of the paper, or how specific this paper is, and we judge this paper, or we evaluate the merit of the paper mostly based on the specialization or the generalization of the paper, instead of really whether or not this paper is a tag paper.
So my upcoming paper in Oakland this year is about patching. So it's about automated patching, and about patching that will ensure that certain safety properties are met after the patch is produced. So it depends, of course, on what is what as to whether. But I think the permanence, not permanence. I mean, there clearly should be some result that has some longevity, at least up to the time of the publication of the result, but hopefully far beyond that in some dimension. And I don't think Jonathan meant to imply that there was nothing in the paper of permanence, but he can correct me if I'm wrong, but rather that the nature of the experiment was such that the reproducibility had a narrow window. But there should be some broad research question that went into that, and some permanent understanding of some kind that would result from that. So I'll let you.
Yeah. So I think two things. Dan, I 100% agree that stability is desirable. Then the question of what's central, right? I would take knowing how stable some piece of knowledge is as the central thing. So you can talk about how stable it is.
Knowledge about that.
Yeah. So knowing how stable a piece of knowledge is, so it's sort of meta-knowledge, is the central thing, not the stability of the knowledge itself. And there's some I guess there's some sort of logical or philosophical judo here, right? Because if what I say is, knowing that this piece of information is stable for 10 seconds, technically, that statement is stable forever. Because the statement is about the stability of this other piece of knowledge, which is time-scoped and everything. And so now I've turned things around to fit your criteria also in some sort of, just word judo way that doesn't actually help anyone. But that's why I think being able to talk about and know what you know and know what you don't know, stating your assumptions, things that we've all talked about, right? That seems to me to be the mark of when you understand something, really. And that's not really even whether it's science or not. It's just you know clearly the complexities, the places where you don't understand the complexity, the richness of the complexity where you do understand it, when things aren't stable, when you need to plan on things not being stable, what pieces of knowledge are stable, I think that with security, you have this weird thing also where you need to only publish things that are, the Rossau et al. Paper uses containment, something like this. I think that's also the biological sciences language, right? So you can't publish something that will benefit the adversaries unduly, right? Because there's ethical concerns there. So you have to also extract some bit of knowledge that's shareable in the sense that it will be stable for long enough, but also that it doesn't tell the adversaries anything they don't already know or anything valuable that they don't already know. And so that's an additional sort of communicability or shareability complaint. There's science communications is a whole other field, but they don't really have to talk about this, which I think is something really interesting that sort of the science of security community could contribute to that whole thing, because we have this other constraint on the sort of ethics of whether we can talk about that thing at all, because it might make things worse. But so that's why I would say that, it's not actually, it might be that the piece of knowledge is actually only stable for 10 seconds. But you've automated the whole experiment process because you're virus total or whatever, and you're processing 100 million of these a day, or whatever the number is. I know that's a little bit too high. some number that's far larger than any human would be able to do. Are each of those things experiments, even though it might only be valid on that piece of malware, you know, because it's a one-off piece of malware? You know, then the question becomes, how do you connect that up with systematic, more general knowledge that's more shareable, more stable? What's it an instance of? What does it instantiate? What does it cluster? Not in the machine learning sense, but like what pieces of knowledge does it cluster with? Is it like these other pieces of malware? So then you're doing family analysis. What can we say about this family? Why does saying something about this family make sense? Why is this family different from this other family? Oh, because different people use it. Like, well, why does that matter? Because they use it for these things, right? Then you start getting into more stable pieces of knowledge that might be useful. But the individual little case study about that one piece of malware contributes to that general knowledge. You can't have the more general knowledge without it, even though it's itself very ephemeral. But I think that's okay. I think we just accept that and deal with it.
All right, Carl, you get last question.
I'm just having real problem getting my head around stability of knowledge. I mean, is something that is like the phlogiston theory that was stable until we replaced that, or a piece of knowledge that's, I don't know, I'm just having a really hard time understanding what's meant by that. Something that's true for 10 seconds, you know, like this bit is a 1 now, and in 10 seconds it may not be. If I need some help.
So if I'm thinking about how I do blacklisting on my system, this IP address is spamming me, it is malicious.
That's a statement that could be true at some particular state.
Yeah. So is that IP address malicious?
Is that a piece of knowledge? I mean, that's a knowledge about that point in time, and it's still true an hour later, but that was true at that time.
Right. That it was true at that time, right? But so I guess when you get into, this is the sort of philosophical jujitsu that you end up with, right? Are knowledge claims all time-stamped? No, not really. Like, so.
I mean, I think about theories that in fact are superseded. Okay, maybe that's knowledge. You know, we thought we knew this, but now we know something different. So I sort of think about it in that sense. But something that I thought I knew for 10 seconds.
Carl, didn't Donald Knuth torture his grad students by telling them to write, to enumerate everything that happened on their computer in a 10-second interval? I think that was his hazing ritual for grad students. It's fantastic when you think about it. What would you say to something that was true and you know at some point it's going to be false, but it hasn't occurred yet, like quantum attacks on crypto, say? You know, we know that that's coming somewhere. We assume it's coming somewhere, but at the moment, the discrete log problem still looks to be pretty hard. Is predicting that moment, I'm asking you actually, is predicting that moment science? Not fair.
What's not, we have some knowledge, we think we have some knowledge about the future of quantum computing maybe, but that's really speculative.
Yeah, so maybe the thing I'm thinking about, going back to the attack papers question, or this very specific technology versioning, right, is like, okay, so I can attack Android version 8.6.2 this way, which people actually say I can attack Android this way, but that's not really stable over Android, it's stable over this like real small version.
It's a very specific, narrow statement.
Yeah.
It'll still be true in 2 weeks.
Well, if you make it that way, right? Yeah.
Right. If you don't make it that way, then it's probably you've overgeneralized.
Yeah. So I think that the question is, in the context of, I think, Dan's point of how broad does it need to be generalizable before it's a scientific claim, I think that the point is the thing that's only narrowly true for that really narrow version might still be a scientific claim even though it's only valid for that very narrow version, even though it doesn't generalize because it contributes to this broader set of things. And it's just knowing that it doesn't apply outside of it.
I think in some sense that's the argument that people mount against attack papers, isn't it? It's like, okay, it's another buffer overflow. We knew about buffer overflows, we just didn't know about that particular one. How big of a deal is that? So that's...
Yeah. And so then what I want to see is that put in the context of case studies, right? To help explain why that's not valuable, right? Like, this is another case study of a thing that's well understood. You're not telling us anything new, or you haven't done the case study very well, or whatever, right? As opposed to what everyone else has said is the same thing.
Jonathan, would you go so far as to say that, back to that question of what's science and what's engineering, that engineering is forensic? You know, I know a lot of people who got into this field not because they knew anything about computer science, but because they wanted to learn how the world works, and the best way to do that is to break things.
I think there's a really interesting question to be solved on what the relationship is between forensics and engineering and science. And I will tell you that from my understanding of the philosophy of science literature, no one really knows what to do with history. Like, the question of, like, there are long-standing, decade-long drop-down fights about whether paleontology is a science, which I think is silly. It's a science, right? But they get real torn up about the fact that there's history involved and how you can't repeat history because it happened once. But I think that there's just a really tight integration in security between what you learn from forensics, like one case that happened this one time that broke a thing, how you want to build the system so that doesn't happen, what you can generalize about those two cases, and how you might use that generalized knowledge to make the engineering more robust to that class of attacks. I think that that all is just really interesting and tight in security and is worth talking about.
All right, let's all take a moment to thank our panel. Oh, Danny, you have one more.